Well, by the clock on my laptop here, it tells me that we've arrived at 4 o'clock on the 16th. As is traditional for events like this, we're going to allow just a moment or two for other people to log on because quite a few people have registered and not everyone is connected yet. So we're going to allow them what we call in the parking world a consideration period of a minute or two just to get themselves connected and so they don't miss any of the fun. So bear with us for a moment and we'll be with you very, very shortly. And as the clock clicks over to 2 minutes past 4, I'll just explain again. We're giving people just a couple of moments to log on to the webinar. Many people have registered, not everyone's connected yet, and we'd hate people to miss anything. So we'll give them just another minute and then we'll get going. Just to repeat my message one last time, as is the way with webinars, quite a few people suddenly think, oh, it's 4 o'clock, I should be logged on. And they haven't logged on yet. So to give latecomers a moment or two to log on, we're not going to start for another 30 seconds or so that people don't miss the start. So as we tick over, I think we should probably get going now. Quite a few people have logged on. A few will undoubtedly come in later. But may I say a very warm welcome to everyone who's registered to attend this webinar to celebrate 70 years of the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund. We've got a very strong panel to have an interesting conversation this afternoon, and our theme is, what have the roads ever done for us? And what will we like them to do from now on? So I'd like everyone who's on this call, on this webinar, to cast the image of John Cleese and Life of Brian in their minds, and instead imagine a keen cyclist, a lively young person, a live wire, if you might, someone with a thirst for getting out and about, who became so frustrated with the state of the roads on which they were traveling that they embarked upon a life's mission to do something about it. You might think I'm talking about someone who's campaigning today, but actually I'm talking about William Rhys Jeffreys, the man who became honorary secretary to the Cyclist Touring Club in 1900. Rhys Jeffreys went on to ride motorcycles, become a leading light in the early days of motoring, but above all, to become a widely recognized expert, perhaps globally the predominant expert in the field of road design, construction, and engineering. For Rhys Jeffreys, the development of well-engineered roads was the key to a better quality of life for everyone. Towards the end of his life, as a successful businessman and connoisseur of the arts, William Rhys Jeffreys was by now living in a handsome house down a narrow country road, romantically named Slugwash Lane, not 10 minutes from my own home, by car or motorbike, and he established a charitable fund to take forward his work in perpetuity after he'd gone, a fund that exists to this day. The fund provides bursaries for engineering qualifications, gives grants for research, and funding for projects relating to the improvement of roads and, importantly, to roadside facilities. The fund was established in 1950, and Rhys Jeffreys himself died in the mid-1950s, leaving a substantial art collection whose value enhanced his endowment, 127 of his paintings, including works by Braque and Matisse, were auctioned at Christie's. And the funds went into bolstering his fund. As trustees of his fund today, I and my fellow trustees are acutely conscious of the fact that Rhys Jeffreys saw roads not just as a way of fueling an economy, but of giving people more opportunity to get out and about, to leave the towns and cities and enjoy the countryside. Hence the funding of numerous roadside rests around the country. On the backdrop behind me, you can see one of those roadside rests and a plaque just over my shoulder, which announces that it was funded by the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund. At the point coronavirus hit and we went into lockdown, we were in the throes of organising an event to mark the 70th anniversary of the creation of this fund. Within days of lockdown, road traffic had fallen back to levels that Rhys Jeffreys himself would have recognised in the 1950s. For what may have turned out now to be an all too brief moment, we actually had the luxury of contemplating a reset to create a new normal. Maybe with traffic already rapidly returning, that moment has slipped past us. Let's hope not. So, as lockdown eases, we organised this virtual conference with the help of PTRC, kindly sponsored by the CILT. We organised this webinar, drawing in expert views of the panel, hopefully you can see on the screen before you now, to discuss the question really not so much of how have we got to where we are, but where are we going from here? And where should we go? What have the roads done for us, but what do we want them to do for us henceforward? In doing so, we're keen to keep Rhys Jeffreys' guiding principles in mind, that roads should be well engineered, well maintained, and designed with, in his own words, beauty in mind. 1950 was a world away from 2020. The UK population in 1950 was around 50 million. Today it's 68 million and rising. The average new car cost then was in the region of 1/3 the cost of an average house. The number of licensed vehicles in Great Britain was around 4 million in 1950. Today, it's approaching 10 times that number, with over 30 million cars. The technology of 2020 is also a very long way from anything that might have been applied or even perhaps imagined in 1950. But our ambitions to promote a thriving economy and a happy, healthy lifestyle are still with us. So how on earth should we do it? And what role should the roads play? On that note, I'm delighted to introduce our panel. We have with us Lynn Sloman of Transport for Quality of Life, Ginny Clark, leading light in the CIHT and former Chief Highway Engineer at Highways England, Natalie Chapman from the Freight Transport Association, Rachel Skinner, next President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and Sujith Kolamtodi from Ricardo. Welcome to you all. You've all prepared an opening set of remarks, not terribly long because we want to get the conversation going. Therefore, first up, I'm going to turn to Lynn. Lynn Sloman, please tell us your thoughts. What do we want from roads? What do we want in the future? Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Steve. I've got 4 things that I think we need to do to enable our road network to make a positive contribution to our quality of life. And the first one of those is to stop building more of them. And there are lots of reasons for that, but maybe the most pressing one is that road building increases carbon emissions because people drive faster, because more roads means more induced traffic, and actually a significant amount of embodied carbon comes from concrete and asphalt and steel. And if we're going to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, which we've signed up to, we're going to need to cut total emissions from the strategic road network over the next decade by probably about 40%. And that is a very, very tough ask, but building roads makes it harder. And so my number 1 priority is let's stop making things worse. Let's stop building more roads. The second thing that I think we can do is think about how to use this incredible asset of the road network in a way that meets the 21st century challenge of obesity and sedentary lifestyles, and all of the ill health that follows from that. And we've seen, coming out of the COVID pandemic, rapid reallocation of road space to temporary cycle lanes. wider pavements to enable social distancing. And I think that's shown what we can do, you know, what's possible. But really that should just be the beginning. And now I think we should be looking at Danish or Dutch style cycle superhighways on or alongside every A and B road in the country, radiating 15 miles from every settlement so that people can safely use an electric bike to get to work. I said earlier on that in order to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, we are going to need very rapid cuts in carbon emissions this decade. And electric vehicles have a very big role to play in helping that, but their rate of take-up is too slow for that to be sufficient on its own. And so we're also going to need significant cuts in personal car mileage. And for that to be feasible, we will need a very much better public transport network. And there are lots of dimensions to how we might create that better public transport network. But one of them is capacity allocation to a zero carbon public transport network that runs regular as clockwork, always on time, connecting any two places bigger than a small village, 6 a.m. in the morning till midnight, 7 days a week. And our road network is the place where that fantastic public transport system should be running for local trips. And so thinking about how we can prioritise public transport on our road network should be a very high priority. And my final point is that I think that we need to give the body that's responsible for our major roads a new mission: to connect people without the necessity of travelling. And just as Rhys Jeffries funded roadside rests, I think that Highways England should be given the job of developing thousands of remote working hubs, super fast enabled, so that a few days a week, office workers can walk or cycle a short distance to their local hub rather than spending an hour sitting on the motorway just to get to the office. And a lot of us experience both the joys and the tribulations of working from home during lockdown. And I think that is going to play a growing role as we come out of COVID. But for many people, particularly maybe younger people, working from home is not a great option. But if we had remote working hubs, then for many more people, it would be possible, not every day, because the social contact of the office can still be important, but maybe 2 or 3 days a week, not to have to travel on the road network at all. And I think if Highways England were able to do that, it would contribute immeasurably to a 21st century vision of a connected, convivial community. Thanks very much.
Excellent, thank you. I'm writing down connected and convivial. They strike me as very good ambitions to have. So we're going to take all of the panel's initial comments first, and then there will be a chance to pose some questions and indeed bring in some questions from people who are texting them in. I'm next going to turn to Ginny Clark. Ginny, I think we're very interested to hear your views next. The floor is yours.
Well, my word, Steve, for you to add to your list is ambition, because I think a lot of what Rhys Jeffries actually was thinking about in the 1950s was he was ambitious for what roads could do for people. And moving forward to where we are today, that ambition, it has with it all the challenges that Lynn has set out as well. And the big challenge for people like me, an engineer, whether in an environmentalist, because it's not just engineers, whether we're scientists, whether we're the people who use the roads and don't want to worry too much about how they're built or how they're managed. But what we want as a population is a good means of connecting us all. And as we say, the last few months have been an obvious absence of that. But what we want for the future is a connectivity, what's a good word that is, for us to live our lives, whether it's at work, at pleasure, or at business. And we'll be hearing more about the statistics that make that a very demanding thing to do for the future. So I want us to be ambitious in terms of how we engineer the road, how we use all these fantastic innovations that the technology people say they have ready, let alone the ones that will be delivered in the next 5 or 10 years, how can they be used effectively to not just give us the convenience of a road transport system, whether it's a public transport system or our own mode of transport, but actually how can it help us remove all those things, whether it's air quality, whether it's noise, whether it's congestion, what is it that we can bring forward with all the knowledge that human beings have now and in the next 10 and 15 years to make that connectivity a reality for us all? Now, I'm of the opinion that engineers have got a lot to contribute to this. It's not just the downside, but equally, we've got to train people to make sure that all those benefits of whether it's technology, whether it's environmental science, whether it's actually how we understand the social aspects of how people connect together, we want all those skills to be available for the service of providing a road transport. I'm very keen that all of that is brought forward and not just viewed from that individual perspective of us driving on a car or riding a bike or walking, but actually it's also brought there in the terms of a service. You know, can our buses provide more of an access, whether it's on a strategic road or whether it's our local road? Can other forms of transport help us for those who are less able to get around? And certainly for transport for the future, this ought to be something that serves all of us. And I'm pretty sure that Rhys Jeffries would have wanted to make sure that there was as much help for the 5-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 35-year-old, the 75 and the 85, and goodness me, the 100-year-old as well. So I think for the future, let's try and make sure this is a future for every one of us rather than just some of us.
Thanks very much. And as I approach 100 years old myself, I couldn't agree more. Well, we often talk about roads and traffic as if cars were the only things that matter, but absolutely vital to our economy, to our health, and to being able to get our protective equipment and our toilet rolls is the logistics sector. So I'm delighted to invite Natalie Chapman next to say a few words from the perspective of the freight industry. Natalie.
Thanks, Steve. So here at FTA, and oh, by the way, we're soon to be renamed Logistics UK, so kind of watch this space. We're always seeking opportunities to make freight more efficient. And we take a whole supply chain view. So we represent road, rail, sea and air. And one freight train, for example, can take up to 70 lorries off the road. So modal shift has a really important role to play in efficiency and sustainability. However, we've got to be realistic. 90% of freight here in the UK is moved by road. So we do have to be realistic to the fact that roads are and will continue to be vitally important to logistics. Roads have lots of different functions for different users, depending on location and the time of day. And there are competing desires and demands, which are often quite difficult to reconcile. And many in urban environments in particular, there is a real kind of push to make roads not just about travel, but also give a sense of place. But all too often, of course, the focus is on how people move about, and logistics is at best an afterthought. So thanks for not leaving me to go last, Steve. But we can't, of course, have that cafe culture unless we've got the coffee beans. So we need to consider how freight is brought holistically into everything we're doing when we're talking about roads. And what we're seeing right now, of course, with schemes to reallocate road space in our towns and cities to encourage more active travel, walking and cycling, and support social distancing, and that is hugely important. It's something that FTA absolutely supports. We support the aims behind this. Otherwise, of course, limited capacity on public transport, with that would see congestion increase as everyone then, of course, piles back into their cars. But we have to ensure that we can still access the curbside to make deliveries, that journey times do not massively increase. Otherwise, fixed shifts and fixed amounts of goods to deliver, we may end up having to put more lorries and vans on the road. So responding to a congestion problem by adding to it, I think is not the way that we want to go. And it's also, of course, not just about urban roads. Our motorways are, of course, essential for that long distance trunking. And HGV drivers by law need somewhere to stop and take their legal breaks. But we have a huge shortage in capacity for overnight lorry parking. And the quality of some of the facilities really leaves an awful lot to be desired. And if we're going to retain the good drivers we have, encourage new ones to the industry, maybe get more women driving, we really need to be doing far better. So what I'd say about freight is something that I think we all too often take for granted. And I think the current crisis, particularly that initial fallout from the panic buying we saw at the start of lockdown, who knew we needed all these loo rolls? I'm sure the people must have them stockpiled somewhere at home now. But it shone a light on how vitally important logistics is to our everyday lives. We've of course been saying it for years, but it was great to hear people, politicians and the press saying that, you know, delivery drivers are essential workers. And in fact, it goes a long way beyond that, because everyone involved in keeping the supply chain moving is playing a crucial role. And actually, rather like our roads, logistics, we think, should be seen as part of essential infrastructure. So we are here to serve the rest of the economy and the people. We don't move stuff for the sake of it. We move it because someone, somewhere, ordered it. And when we take the rubbish and recycling away, it's because someone, somewhere, created it. So as our population grows, so does our demand for goods and servicing. So therefore, when we're building new communities, as well as considering how we incorporate things like, you know, gas, electricity, water, broadband, public transport, schools and hospitals, we also need to think about how we best design the needs of logistics. How can we enable deliveries to be made quietly at night to shops? How will residents receive their online deliveries? And where will we put the big sheds that we need to run our operations from? And then, of course, we also need to think about what the future looks like. What will be our future buying habits? What's going to be the next big disruptor? And how will that affect our demand on logistics and indeed on personal travel? We've seen a huge accelerated growth in the online shopping and during lockdown, and much of that behaviour is expected to stick. But what are the vehicles of the future going to look like as we move towards zero emission technologies and automation? And how will our roads need to adapt? So I think there's some things that would be great to pick up in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And may I be amongst the first people to say, with your new acronym, we're all looking to give you good luck. We'll come back to many of those themes, I'm absolutely sure. But next, in the theme of having some engineering input here, I'm delighted to introduce Sujith. Sujith, give us your perspective, please, from Ricardo, indeed from your worldview.
Thanks a lot, Steve. So when trying to answer this question, what have the roads ever done for us? I thought I'd like to really look at the economic benefits and try and balance them up against the environmental impact. So let's start by thinking about those economic benefits, and if we can actually try and quantify them. So I looked into this a little bit, in preparation for this, and there is quite a bit of research on this topic, and I thought I'd pull out a few figures for you. So first of all, the London School of Economics did some research on this topic a few years ago. They looked at 31 major new road construction schemes over a 10-year period, and they found that, for those schemes where there was an improvement in accessibility, there were some increases in employment. So a 10% increase in accessibility, and what do I mean by that? If we reduce travel times or reduce fuel costs, we can see something like a 3 to 4% increase in the numbers of businesses operating in that location around the new road scheme, and corresponding increases in employment. Okay, sounds good. There are also increases in wage growth, typically 2 to 3%. Other studies, in particular studies carried out for the Department for Transport, indicate that increasing accessibility can also lead to increases in local productivity, around 0.7%. Now, those figures don't sound huge in terms of the benefits. We're talking about quite large scale investments here in those new road schemes. But I also want to look at the counterpoint. What are the damage costs associated with road transport? And in particular, what are the environmental impacts? And really to pick up on some of the points that Lynn made as well. So here in Ricardo, we run some of the UK's air quality monitoring networks on behalf of DEFRA. And we've carried out some research last year for DEFRA to look at some source apportionment from the data that we collect. Where are the biggest sources, for each of the pollutants that we might be interested in? And certainly for oxides of nitrogen, NOx emissions, they're dominated by emissions from the road transport sector. And why are NOx emissions important? Well, nitrogen dioxide, which is one of those NOx emissions, is very heavily implicated in respiratory illnesses, damage to human health, and that of course has cost to the economy. In addition, transport is a big contributor to particulate emissions as well, again implicated in respiratory illnesses and heart disease, again huge damage to human health. And Lynn has already highlighted the issue, the fundamental issue we need to be thinking much more about is transport's contribution to climate change. If we're to achieve net zero emissions, we really need to be, radically rethinking how we provide in the transport sector, how we get around. Now, in addition to thinking about those impacts, just in terms of, the health impacts and wider impacts, we can also put monetary values on it. And I'm going to use government figures here. So a few years ago, the Cabinet Office published some data to sort of quantify the environmental impacts in monetary terms of the road transport sector. So something like between 4 and 10 billion pounds per year for air quality impacts, and just under 4 billion pounds for greenhouse gas emissions. On top of that, there are also damage costs associated with noise, something like 3 to 5 billion pounds associated with environmental noise. So these are pretty big numbers in terms of the damage costs. And that's before we even get into things like congestion, road accidents, and the costs of physical inactivity on health. So I've got to ask, is there a better way if we want to have a greater focus on quality of life? Can we see a broader range of transport modes on our roads in the future? Should our transport infrastructure programs put more emphasis on shifting away from cars, vans, and trucks, and more emphasis towards non-motorized travel modes and rail? And where we do continue to invest in road infrastructure, maybe this should be focused on speeding up the transition to new technologies. So, electric vehicles, Lynn's mentioned this already, they're going to play an important part in the future. Maybe some of that investment should be about speeding up the deployment of en route charging infrastructure. If we look at that charging infrastructure on the strategic road network today, the provision is quite poor. Maybe there's more that we could be doing there. If we look at the freight sector, we've also got a massively decarbonized road freight. So should we be looking at investment in electric road systems where we have overhead catenary lines to provide power to trucks, or battery charging depots for trucks, or even hydrogen refueling stations for long distance trucks? And then finally, should we be seeing much more reallocation of road space? Again, picking up on Lynn's point, moving away from private vehicles, or certainly single occupancy private vehicles. Should we be prioritizing high occupancy vehicles on our roads, and also cycling and walking? Thank you.
Thank you, Sujith. And rounding off the initial observations by the panel, delighted to say, Rachel, you have the floor.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much. Who knew that 2020 was going to be a year when maybe all of us should have placed a bet on making many conference presentations while dressed in slippers and, in my case, running kit, but there we go, it's all good. So always dangerous to go last, but actually in this case quite handy, because I think I'm going to kind of touch on quite a lot of the pieces that others have mentioned, which is good. If I had to add a word to your list, Steve, in terms of what we'd like the roads to do for us from now, I think my one would be optimism. Because I guess you can kind of look back and see the good news, as we've been hearing, that roads so far have done a nice job of connecting people and places and things. They've allowed trade and movement and growth and all that good stuff. And actually they've done that through all sorts of very different times. And I suppose we're in one of those interesting times right now, aren't we? But actually what's really interesting is that if you kind of treat the 6,000, I think it is, years of having roads in some way, shape or form, it's only actually the last 50 of those years when we've become so utterly reliant, it seems, on private cars as a key component of how we actually get around. If you put that into a kind of a clock analogy, certainly for the UK, it means we're sort of, that's really at sort of 11:45 p.m. in terms of the lifespan of these roads. So it does feel like there's a massive opportunity right now to just have a bit of a reset and a rethink, and recognise that these roads are far from perfect. We know there are issues around congestion and safety and air pollution, carbon, noise, severance, etc. We know all of that. But we do have an opportunity, I think, to get them much more right going forward. And I think the other interesting piece is that right now, as we've just heard from a couple of others actually, we've got competition, because the digital piece is obviously playing an ever greater part, and certainly through COVID we've seen that, haven't we, in terms of the ability to do far more stuff online. So I guess I'd argue that we're nowhere near the place or the time when we won't need any physical connectivity between places, of course, but maybe there is an opportunity for new models to start to emerge where perhaps places could be sort of, you know, thriving, growing things without needing the same degree of connectivity as we've seen so far. Who knows? So I guess the big question is, what on earth does that actually mean for the roads going forward? So I think there are three big areas or three opportunities, maybe three responsibilities really of the road network, both local and strategic, as we go forward. The first one, in some ways all of these have been touched on, but I think maybe there's a slightly different take in terms of the way I would put them together. The first one is around the kind of the social opportunity and responsibility. So coming back to some of what Lynn was saying and others as well, we need to make the roads work much harder to help us level up. And I don't just mean in the north-south divide type sense in a UK context, I mean within places and so on as well. Ginny made the point that essentially roads have kind of, they enable all other modes really to exist, you know, in order to have a bus, a cycle network, walking network, road freight, etc. But also, you also need a road network in order to get to all the other roads, whether you're talking about railways or airports and so on, because it's a rare person who actually lives above the station or sleeps on an airport bench, I would suggest. So actually, you know, we do rely on these things all of the time, but because of the nature of the connectivity, we have left people behind, we have left communities behind. And I think actually in terms of the onward investment in roads, I think there's a huge amount we could do to sort that out and to think about maybe where there are small bits of infrastructure that would make a transformational difference in terms of first mile, last mile and so on, in terms of allowing people to access a far greater range of opportunities that they simply can't at the moment. The second opportunity or responsibility, and we've heard a lot about this already, so I'll just touch on this one briefly, is obviously the carbon one. We obviously need to make the road network work a lot harder as we make progress towards net zero, or I don't know, even more dramatically, maybe even genuinely zero carbon roads. You never know one day. We know that the roads are a massive cause of both air quality issues locally, but also in a connected way to the global climate change piece as well. We know that on the one hand, roads give us mobility, but they also contribute, depending on the stats you look at, 17–18% of the total global carbon emissions are simply because of the fact we've got vehicles using our roads all over the world. And that's a huge percentage already. And actually, embarrassingly, it's going to grow, because as other industries get to grips with bringing down their emissions in an absolute sense, the percentage around the roads piece could potentially actually get larger as others, as I say, manage to bring their emissions down. It won't necessarily mean it absolutely gets larger, but in a relative sense, it could well do. That has all the makings of, as I say, quite a serious embarrassment. So there's obviously lots we can do about that. The active travel piece, we've talked about that. We should maybe thank COVID for the interest and the energy in that space right now, but how do we catch that, make it stick? As Natalie was saying, you know, which trips are really essential? COVID, again, has given us a new lens on what essential really means, not just in terms of freight and how our loo roll arrives and how we clean our teeth and all the rest of it, but also, you know, across the whole range of different things. What is really essential to us? What have we actually taken for granted, you know, until now, really? We do need to get people back onto public transport, although my thought there, very briefly, is that getting people back onto public transport doesn't mean we put them back onto the same things necessarily that they would have done previously. We don't need to do that. We've got all sorts of new technologies, new opportunities, obviously things that are lower carbon going forward, and sharing is going to be utterly essential in terms of those, you know, the ways that we go forward and we piece back together that net zero road system. And obviously across all of this, across all the different modes, we need to be talking far more about zero emissions, the zero carbon component. It isn't just about walking and cycling, as I've just been saying, it's about all the different things. It's about electric buses, it is about EVs, and ideally it's about, as I say, the sharing piece as well. Of course, even beyond that, there's a piece around carbon in construction. We do need to think about, as and when we build or upgrade roads, you know, how, I guess, tackling the really thorny problem of how we do that by designing out carbon from concept to delivery. I don't think we've ever done that seriously, and we certainly haven't done it at scale, but it feels like now might be the time to try. So the final piece, I guess, in terms of that, the third responsibility is, I think we've just got to make much better use of what we've already got. We need to make the roads as the existing asset just work much harder. And I think there's kind of a supply side to this. You know, how can we get more clever about how we use the road space over the day? Can we flex the space? Again, as we've just been hearing to some extent, but maybe over a day, over a week, over a month, or over a year, you know, could we vary, I don't know, cycle and walking routes to suit demand far better? Can we get much smarter in both an actual sense and also as a tech-led sense in terms of how we might actually use road space differently according to, you know, circumstances that may in themselves be fairly live in real time? Could we build on some of the trials that are happening, for example, in London, but I bet there are others elsewhere, to do with curb curbside use and getting more flexible about that. You've got dozens of different competing uses at the curbside. How do we make that space work better for us over the full 24 hours? And of course, then when you thought about the supply side, you have to think about the demand side. And how do we smooth out demand? We create the rules of the game in terms of when people travel, where they travel, what time they set off, what time they need to get there by. COVID has shown us we can change that. So we could get far, far more from our roads asset if we wanted to, and the whole thing could work much more efficiently. It could be far, far cleaner overall. And again, obviously not just in cars. We could really, really think that one through differently if we wanted to. So I think there's endless opportunity to make the network that we already got work better, and to develop it in future in a way that is far smarter. Frankly, we kind of know what we want. We want something that's safe and secure and easy to use, affordable, healthy, and so on. We know what we don't want. And we certainly don't need to stifle mobility in order to achieve something much better than we've already got. There you go. Hope that's provoked a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And if it weren't for the fact that we booked this for another hour, I would say that was an excellent way to end. With a
I can
very
repeat it later if you like. That's fine.
Yeah, fine. Keep those notes. Now, from here on, we're in conversation. So we're going to try to have a conversation amongst ourselves, but bringing in some of the comments that have been coming in from outside. But to kick us off, I'm very taken with the fact that I've just written down quite a few of the things that you, the panel members, have been saying, and you posed between you about 57 questions. So for the next 50 minutes, I'm going to be pressing you on some answers. And I'm going to start with this. Several of you have talked about the opportunities of new technology, perhaps in the design and construction of the road, perhaps in the design and operation of the vehicle. And what I want to hear from you is, how are we going to make that happen? Who's going to pay? And if we go to something as dramatic as a catenary above motorways for lorries, you're going to take me some persuading to make me think that's going to work. But, quite dramatic ideas there, but they're going to cost money and someone's going to have to pay for it. So I just want to hear your ideas on where the money's going to come from. I'm going to start with Natalie. And the reason I'm going to start there is that one of the big challenges we've got is in the design and the motive power of big trucks. People are talking perhaps about some form of electrification, some form of hydrogen, maybe catenary, as Sujith has said. But who on earth is going to develop that when we're talking about commercial businesses running on low margins? Where's the money coming from? Natalie.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question, Steve. And I think, when we're talking about decarbonising transport and decarbonising freight vehicles, at the smaller end, I think we're pretty clear that we're looking electric, and it's just about how we refine that further and how we make sure that that our charging infrastructure is up to the job for that. But once you start to get to the heavier end of vehicles, it's really, really difficult to work out exactly what we're going to do to decarbonise. And the jury, quite frankly, is still out. We're still trying to work out what is the right technology to back. So we've been involved at FTA in discussions about developing a definition of an ultra low emission truck, because what businesses say to us is they're willing to invest, and many are already investing and trialling different things. So Waitrose and John Lewis, for example, are trialling lots of things with gas vehicles. But what businesses really need to know, if they are going to be making this big additional investment, is that they are backing the right technology, and that in a couple of years' time, that all of a sudden we're not going to go, oh no, gas isn't the answer, it's hydrogen, or no, hydrogen is not the answer, it's electric but with catenary systems. And so we need to make a decision, and it might be that it's more than one technology, because vehicles are used flexibly and for different ways. So we might need something that works for kind of the long haul trunking, and something that works in the urban environment, and perhaps something that works kind of flexibly for vehicles that are going to go from one environment to the other as well. So we really urgently need to make that decision on what the technology is that we need to back. So and there seems to be kind of a real pressure on that. And also, it's not just the technology, but it's the fuels as well. So there might be something that we can do to also give some additional benefit, or even perhaps some of the stepping stones. So we might not be jumping to electric catenary systems for trucks, in the next 5-10 years. That might be a little bit further down the line. So is there something we can do around what are the better fuels to use? So what are the alternatives to diesel? Because at the moment, we're a little bit short on alternatives for those larger vehicles. But the point of who pays, it is all about business case. We're talking about in logistics with 1-2% margins. And clearly, I think when we get out of the COVID crisis, the government's going to be a little bit skint and is going to be looking for ways in which they're going to be recouping for all the expenditure they've already made. So we do need to think very carefully about, yes, what is that right technology? Give businesses the certainty to invest. And those businesses that kind of can afford to will lead the way. There will be some trickle down impact on that, because then others will follow as these vehicles and the technology becomes more widely available. We're already seeing that with electric. The cost of electric vans is coming down. It still is more expensive than its diesel counterpart, but then you have to look at the whole life and the whole energy costs as well, if you're not filling that up with diesel. So it's those kind of upfront costs, also the certainty about residual value. So it's not just what you pay for a vehicle up front, but it's what you get for when you sell it at the end of its time as well. So I think there's a lot of questions. So I don't think I've necessarily given you the answer, Steve. I think I've just posed a load more questions there. But it's something we really do need to think about is who pays. And actually, just finally on that point, one of the discussions we were having, I was on the Mayor of London's Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Task Force. One of the very early discussions we were having about EV infrastructure is that question of who pays. Because if you look at electric cars, who can afford electric cars? It's rich people. They are a lot more expensive at the moment. Those prices will come down. So should poorer people subsidise the transport for richer people? How should that best be done? But you need that seed funding. So it's sorry, I think I've posed more questions for you, Steve, but I'll be interested to hear the other panel's thoughts.
Well, that's what you're about to hear, because you have posed more questions. But what did creep in towards the end there is the sense that some of this is going to have to come from central government, and central government gets its money from taxes, and all of us in work pay taxes, and hopefully there'll be lots of us in work this time next year, because that's what we're aiming for. I'm going to come to Lynn next but one. I'm going to come to Sujith first. Lynn, I'm going to come to you because you painted this vision for us of a really intensive bus service, essentially. I've written down 7 a.m. till midnight bus service, frequent services. It all sounds great. I'd be interested in your image of what those vehicles might be like. And again, given that today the bus companies in this country are on their knees, the best performing bus company this week is carrying up to 40% of its pre-COVID passenger ridership, and yet is being required to run a service that could carry far more. And I can't be the only person that's worried about that. So there's a question there. But Sujith, I'd like to come back to you here, because you mentioned quite a lot of ideas for things that could be done. And I'm just wondering, given your the Ricardo experience of consulting on this, not just in this country, but around the world, has anywhere else cracked this? Is elsewhere, are national governments stepping up to the plate? Are they expecting the private sector? Is it benefactors? Where's it all happening? How are other people making this happen?
I think the problems are similar all over the world at the moment, and particularly if we talk about solving the carbon problem. I mean, this is a big issue, and I think Lynn, and it's really, if we would have to take the best ideas from different countries. So Lynn mentioned Denmark, in terms of cycle provision. I went to Denmark for the first time 2 years ago. I was absolutely astounded, loved it. Just from the cycle infrastructure there, it shows what can be done. It's also clear when we look at other countries that we can change track. So the Netherlands, I always think of the Netherlands as a good example of a country that was heading down the same pathway as we were in terms of motorization through the 60s and into the early 70s. And then a spate of child deaths on the roads, killed by motorists that were cycling, led to public protests. And that massively changed the story in the Netherlands. And the government shifted away from motorization and more towards investing in cycling infrastructure. And that's what, when we look at the Netherlands now, it's a world apart from the UK, but 40, 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. So I think there is scope for doing more. Just to pick up on some of the new technologies, and particularly on HGVs, and Natalie was talking about, we don't know the right answer. I totally agree with that. I think right at this point in time, it is very unclear what the right solution is for HGVs. We've done some research on this last year for the Committee on Climate Change that fed into the Net Zero report, and electric catenary systems, battery electric HGVs, hydrogen HGVs, they're all, in terms of overall costs out to 2050, very similar, but it's very unclear what the best solution is today. And actually for the freight sector, we also need to be looking at what, our colleagues internationally are doing. For international freight, if we want to make sure that our system is compatible with our neighbours in mainland Europe, then we need to be clear on what's happening there as well. Otherwise, we can't make decisions in isolation. And then when it comes to funding it, I think we need to look at what's been happening elsewhere in the economy and in the transport sector when we're looking at the deployment of new technologies. So right now, the Department for Transport is running competitions on not for the freight sector, but for hydrogen for transport more widely. So funding the deployment of hydrogen refueling stations and hydrogen fleets, funding advanced biofuel demonstration plants. Now, why can't we do that for the freight sector? It's actually going to be very difficult to decarbonize the freight sector. They won't be able to do it on their own. The costs are huge. This is the role of government to play a role in supporting that. And yes, we might need to draw on taxpayer money, but we need to recognize that the freight sector benefits all of us, right? We all benefit from it. We're all reliant on goods being transported to our door. I think that's the role of government to make use of those funds.
Susan, thank you. Put my hands up. Yes, I was speaking on mute. It won't be the last time today. Lynn, I'm going to come back to you here. So I once was chatting with somebody who ran a bus company who said what I needed to understand was a bus is a shed on wheels. And I felt rather saddened by that approach to life. Sometimes I think he was describing it accurately. The vision you're painting sounded a lot more attractive to me, but is it commercial?
I don't think we should think about our public transport network as something which is defined by whether or not it's commercial. Essentially, if we're going to act on our obligation to tackle climate change, we've got to recognise a basic right for people to be able to get around without having to own and drive a car. And what follows from that is that we have to have, if you like, universal basic provision of a high quality public transport network, one which we singularly lack in this country. And thinking that that is just something that can be left as a commercial service seems to me to be a complete sort of abrogation of our responsibility to act to respond to the climate emergency. The question of how you fund it, if one accepts that it's not necessarily a commercial prospect, I think is particularly difficult in this country because we are so fixated on money for local services coming from the centre. And in that, we are different to very many other countries around the world. We did a study a few years ago where we looked at all the different ways that other countries raise funding for local public transport, of which there were about 20, of which probably about 3 are widely used in the UK. And I think the thing that we do really badly is recognise that if you give more powers at the local level, as a local authority, you can identify a number of beneficiaries of a much better public transport service, for example, all of whom might be willing to pay if they know that that money is going into making their service better. And so, France has the public transport payroll levy, Versement Transport, and that's been responsible for the renaissance of trams in French cities over the last couple of decades. And increasingly is the reason why French cities are moving to free public transport, which is what Dunkirk's now been doing for a year and a half. Calais began at the beginning of this year. And they can do that because employers in those towns and cities recognise that it's in their interest to have a good public transport service so that their employees can get to work and so they can attract people from a wider area. And so they put money into the public transport service. And in exactly the same way, if you think about the visitor levy, which, if you go to Switzerland or Germany or Austria, you might pay an extra euro or two per night in your hotel. And that money can go into improving the public transport network so that visitors can benefit from it. If we were able to capture even a proportion of the uplift in land value that happens as a result of property development and recycle that into enhancing public transport infrastructure and services, we would be made. Germany, the Netherlands are far better. They probably capture about 75% of the uplift in land value. We capture, I think the last estimate I saw was something like around about 20% of the uplift in land value. And, if we did that, we'd be able to build the kind of excellent public transport services that other countries have. So I think this is something where government has to let go and stop throttling things and say, yeah, we're going to trust local authorities. We're going to give them the powers, if they wish, to introduce an employer's levy to pay for public transport, to introduce a tourism levy, to capture the uplift in land value. And I think if we did that, local authorities with their local communities would be able to decide whether they wanted a fantastic public transport network or actually they weren't that bothered. And the experience in France, where about 80% of municipalities have introduced the public transport levy, is actually when you ask people, or when you consider it at that local level, people want it. People want those better services. They don't want the kind of third world quality of, frankly, ramshackle, irregular, unreliable public transport that we have in this country. We all go to Europe and say, oh, isn't it fantastic? But we never seem to think about the reasons why they've got it, that we could have it here too. And so I think giving more powers to local authorities to raise funding for excellent services would actually unlock an awful lot and would enable us to do a lot more than we are at the moment.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to follow on. So I'm going to follow on with that idea and go to Rachel next. Then I'm going to be going to Ginny, because I want to come back to this point about training and about skills that you mentioned, that if we're going to have a different future, then we need the engineers and architects of that future perhaps to be thinking differently and to have a different skill set themselves. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that. But before I do that, Rachel, I'm very taken with what Lynn was saying. People go to Europe, they see something better. Peter Molyneux has come online. He's saying, maybe we're all a bit too much the self-appointed experts here. We're suggesting solutions. Are we doing enough to understand what people actually want from the transport system and from the roads? Or should we be telling them what the answers are? Or should we be offering them answers, or indeed just asking them rather more than we do currently? How would you like this to be? What would you say to that?
No, I think it's absolutely right. And hi, Peter, and thank you, because I think it's a really valid comment. In reality, I think it's a mix of the two in terms of that engagement process, isn't it? Because I think there's a mix of what people want and perceive they need versus the opportunity to provide something which actually in some cases might be even better than some of the thoughts they might have had, I guess, to begin with, and some of those needs. I guess my other immediate kind of thoughts around that generally are we don't have to do everything all at once, and it doesn't have to be one size fits all. So if we know that there are particular needs in particular places, and I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at recently has been around looking at different types of communities, different types of users in a transport sense in terms of the actual population distribution and so on, and just really thinking through actually what would work best where. Because if we just go out and just sort of scatter things all over the map, it's a recipe for disaster, and frankly a lot of wasted money, as I think we'd all probably agree. I think though within that, I mean, as I say, it doesn't have to be one size fits all. We've got lots of examples, haven't we, where multiple solutions, multiple brands, I guess, can coexist, and to some extent competition is healthy in that respect in terms of bringing down costs and looking for efficiencies in terms of the absolute monetary cost of some of these things. But I think the flip side of that though is that, to me, at the moment, the way that we think about the problem in terms of the benefit versus the cost of some of these different things doesn't fully account for things to do with whether it's carbon or whether it's some of the wider mobility things to do with health and levels of activity, that kind of thing. If we could find a way to actually look at that investment very, very differently, and I'm not just talking about changing the Green Book rules or anything similar to that, because actually I don't think that necessarily goes quite far enough. I think that in itself might start to change behaviours and change appetites for change towards the better as well. I suppose though, somebody mentioned something around change generally as well just a few minutes ago. I personally think that we as an industry, and as I suppose the transport professionals who are, I guess our responsibility is to look across and to see what the opportunities are and to try to steer things in the right direction. I think we should be setting a direction of travel in terms of the overall kind of outcomes we're after, in terms of the broad specification, I suppose, in terms of what we're after. But I don't think we should try to nail down all of the specifics, because I think they will evolve through technology, but also because, as I say, you know, one size, one place is not the same as another. And I think we need to allow things to come through to their best advantage where we possibly can. Do you want me to come on now in terms of the thinking around how engineers, architects and so on need to start to think differently, or pause there?
Well, pause for a sec, because I just want to check. So would you say then that this fits with what Lynn was saying about greater devolved responsibility, that if both the raising of money and the decisions were devolved to a regional perhaps, or a more local tier of government, that level of government will be more attuned to what the people who live in that place actually want and were willing to pay for?
Personally, I mean, we are seeing a degree of that in any case through things like the subnational transport bodies and similar in any case. And I do think there is definitely a place for that to grow and sort of thrive in that respect. But I think there's two bits. There's the level of funding overall, the absolute, you know, pound note value of what can we pump into the system. But then there's also the bit around how that's then allocated kind of across the geography, if you like. And I guess the ideal thing is to find a way, obviously, to generate the greatest amount of investment, but then to make sure that what we're doing is investing it to best advantage. And I guess that's a public and a private sector problem in there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll let you have a brief shot at the skills question before I go to Ginny, and then I'm going to come back to Lynn, because I want to hear Lynn's view on what you were saying about the case for some road building where there are disconnected communities who, for the lack of that, might actually thrive. But before I do that, Ginny, you're the champion of skills here. What are these skills that we're lacking at the moment, and how are we going to cause them to come into being? And what is the CIHT doing about it?
I think the thing about lack of skills is not so much individually lack of skills. It's the fact that we still don't connect enough between the skill sets. So we're talking as a group of people here. We come from, I would guess, a vast variety of backgrounds about how we were trained, how we got our interest in the subjects we do. And the real issue about skills going forward is how can we make the best use of that interest, enthusiasm and training that we've tended to develop into silos in our history, I think. But the one thing that, whether it's Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation, or whether it's logistics industry or the environmental sector, the one real benefit we've all found is that actually, if we pool our skills together, we are much better at finding the solutions, the way forward, even to the extent, should I say, of actually getting the funders in there as well. Because for goodness me, the number of times that projects are developed without actually thinking about, well, who's going to pay for this? You know, what are the benefits of this? Let's bring in the psychologists and the socialists. Now, the socialists, the social scientists, sorry, not political.
We're apolitical on this webinar.
Yes. So I think, one, how do we use the skills? There is actually also how are we going to get people interested enough to want to be involved in this sector? And that's something is certainly that people like CIHT are spending a lot of time trying to think about, are we looking at the right sectors in the population? Are we too narrow in our focus about where we want to train people? How are we going to interest young people? If Greta Thunberg has done one thing, she has energized actually the belief that everybody can have a say about this, whether they're young, whether they're middle-aged, whether they're old. It's not just because I'm getting old, I keep on worrying about the elderly, but everybody has a right to have a view on this. So how do we make sure that views are translated into skill training, that are then translated into how you plan, how you design, how you execute, and actually how you operate transport? And CIHT, in the work they're doing, are trying to bring these things together. And certainly in other sectors that I've been involved with, whether it's the air sector, the rail, other modes of transport, we probably on the roadside have been slowest at utilising these skills. So I think it is about where is the source of the people going to come from who want to be interested in this. Secondly, how are we going to train them? And I don't just mean a degree course or a technical training for those who are actually going to worry about producing something. But it is also, thirdly, how do we then exercise those skills within a community sense? So I'm very taken with this discussion about local versus national, because actually you need both. You know, my background has been predominantly in looking at national transport, but I was brought up within a local sector or a local authority type understanding of transport. And the big gulf between these still exists. And that's where I think the skill set needs to be that it's transferable. You know, there aren't local authority transport planners and there aren't national transport planners. There must only be transport planners as one. So those are my hobbies, my hobby horses for skills. But the key source is we've got to get people interested in trying to find the solutions.
Okay. I'm going to go to Lynn, but I might well, if we've got time, come back to how do we do that? Because I'm very conscious, again, I've written down another 6 questions you posed for us, and we're definitely going to run out of time. I don't want the people who are posting questions online to think that I'm ignoring you or forgetting that you're there. There are a couple of things here that we will find time to come back to, though I feel it pains me more than I can tell you to come to it. We will raise the issue of road user charging and demand management. We will most definitely come on next, after Lynn has spoken, to the issue of road space allocation. And I'm going to talk to Natalie first there, because we're getting a lot of views about road space allocation. And let's just say even people on the chat don't agree with each other. And I've got a comment here from Neil Gregg from IOM Road Smart, which is basically saying some of the measures to promote cycling and walking seem to be being rushed in rather haphazardly and are at risk of being rushed out again, because as the traffic comes back, people are going to think this wasn't a very good design. Why am I sitting in a traffic jam next to an empty cycle lane? I've certainly had people say that to me in the last few days. So we will come to those things. And I'm just going to say the word ecosystem because we're required to say the word ecosystem in all conversations about transport at the moment. But first of all, communities that have been left behind. We hear a lot about that from our government at the moment. We're levelling up, not levelling down. You need places to be connected. Lynn, surely there's a case for roads spending for some places in this country.
So I don't think that lack of roads is what is leading to disconnected communities. We do have disconnected communities because people only have a bus service once a week. And as Ginny has been saying, you know, if you're too old, if you have a disability, that means you can't drive a car. If you haven't got enough money to own a car, if you're a young person, then the road car model for mobility really doesn't work very well for you. And we absolutely need to be putting money into providing a universal basic service that enables everybody to get around. And I don't think the road building is what you would do first with the limited money you'd have available. What you do first is make sure that there's a comprehensive, very high quality public transport network. I just wanted to pick up on the point about training, which isn't my area at all, except to say that if what we want to do is to attract the youngest and most able and most imaginative and most ambitious young people to come into the world of transport planning and civil engineering, the way to inspire those young people to do that is absolutely by the professional institutions saying, we have the biggest challenge of our lifetimes here. Transport is the sector of the economy which is now the biggest carbon emitter. Somehow we have to get those emissions down dramatically in the next 10 years. This is not a challenge for 2050, it's a challenge for 2030. And we need the best brains in the country to help us to do that. And I think that if we were able to embrace that challenge, and if the professional institutions were to be out there saying that is what we're all about, then, you know, we would be inundated with young people saying, yeah, this is something that I want to do. And I just quickly want to say, I saw in the chat Glenn's suggestion that maybe the next road investment strategy should be called the road reallocation strategy. And I think that's a really great idea. And we should definitely say that that's what it should be called. And lots of people have been talking about, and as you said, Steve, we'll come on to talking about road user charging. And I totally agree that part of the mix has to be pay as you drive, pay per mile road user charging. We've talked about it as an eco levy. And I think the way that one frames it is crucial to determining public acceptability. But actually, all the evidence from London and from Stockholm and from Milan and places that have introduced forms of road user charging is that when you do it, people actually quite like it because it enables you to deliver a better city or even a better kind of road network if you manage what is essentially a limited resource. So very, very definitely that ought to be part of the mix. Oh, and my final point actually is that I totally agree with Ginny that what we need is some more socialists here.
I think I said earlier, this is an apolitical broadcast, so we aren't going to get into any of that because let's face it, if we do, we will be interrupted because my younger son will come charging through that door and start spouting his opinions, which frankly, none of us wants to hear. Now, we're going to talk about road space reallocation for a moment. Very strong views here on how it's being done, whether it's being done wisely, who it should be done by, whether it should be done, whether we should have a road reallocation strategy, whether indeed we should make the mission of Highways England, as Lynn suggested, something quite different. And one of the things I'd like to come back is that idea of 1,000 workspaces blooming, whether that's motorway service areas, which could be linked with Natalie's upgraded rest areas for truck drivers. But before we do that, I want to hear from Natalie on the issue of road space reallocation, particularly contentious in our town and city centres where we still have some shops, I'm told, and we'd like to get stuff on the shelves. Then I'm going to go Sujith on that because I know Sujith is a man who thinks nothing of cycling 70 miles on a Sunday morning and almost certainly has views on this. So Natalie first and then Sujith.
Thanks, Steve. So, yeah, clearly we've got this big programme that started, and some of this it's very time critical because we are dealing with the challenges we've got right now of the sort of reopening of the economy, of the fact that we're having to deal with social distancing, with the limited capacity we've got in public transport. We've got an opportunity to get more people walking and cycling, and I think that there's lots of opportunity to be seen in there, but absolutely we're seeing lots of big mistakes coming through because these schemes are being drawn up incredibly quickly. But I think we need to be careful. So there is a time imperative to doing this. You know, if in an ideal world we'd sit there with a lovely sheet of paper, we'd be planning this properly, we'd spend, you know, weeks and months making sure we've got the right schemes in place. But we kind of don't have that time at the moment because of the current circumstances that we're in. So what's really important, certainly from a logistics point of view, and a thing that we have been pushing at FTA, is making sure that there is really good guidance for local authorities. So the first iteration of guidance that came down from DFT to local authorities contained a teeny tiny mention of deliveries. It said, or something about you need to just think about deliveries and blue badge holders. But it didn't really go into any explanation of, well, what do you need to be thinking about? And the reality is that most local authorities don't have freight experts in their transport planning teams. They'll have people that might know a bit here and there, but they don't necessarily have a dedicated person, or they don't have that expertise, that sort of level of expertise. So providing good quality guidance so that they know that they are doing things in the right way, that they can design schemes that work holistically for everyone, is really important. So in the absence of that guidance, we did produce initially a note that we were sending around to as many local authorities as we could to say, please think about, we need access to the curbside, and if you take away too much space for freight, you know, where are those vehicles going to go, what's the knock-on effect? And, you know, things like, again, a lot of residential roads that have been sort of turned traffic free, that's great. But of course, people are wanting home deliveries, particularly people that are continuing to self-isolate and shield. We still need to get those vehicles through to those people. So think about how we manage those. And whilst there might be some long-term things we can do looking at last mile logistics, we're talking about the here and now and the resources we've got currently. So the really important thing to us is making sure we've got really good, strong dialogue with local authorities. We had an example very recently in the last sort of week or so with the City of London, where we had a pub that nearly had to close because actually it wasn't going to be able to get any beer delivered, which is kind of quite crucial to a pub being open. Now, fortunately, the City of London are quite a pragmatic authority. They were not going to let a pub close because it couldn't get beer. So we got a solution. There's been a bit of compromises that have to be made, and that, you know, logistics at the end of the day is about finding solutions, but what we need to know is the parameters that we're working within, and we need some reasonable parameters. So it's about an ongoing dialogue, and I think it's about ensuring that these schemes going in that we're able to flex them quite quickly when we realise that issues are arising.
Thank you. And Sujith, I mean, there's an issue there about dialogue and understanding things, but also I just wonder whether we're having to respond very quickly, people are doing things quickly, but surely that's a chance to try things out. And if they're not working very well, do something different, be flexible, be ready to say, we didn't get that one quite right. Let's learn from that. Let's monitor what's going on and let's try a different approach if something else seems more appropriate. So is flexibility part of the answer?
I mean, I'd hope it is, but at the moment, I'm a little bit concerned with some of the ways in which the pop-up bicycle schemes have been put in place. We're also seeing, just something I was reading last night, that we're seeing political pressure being brought to bear on some of those schemes where there's one in Surrey that was open for, I think, 3 days, and then the local MP got involved and shut it down very quickly. And, again, there were, some local residents not happy with the scheme. So I think there is a need to think about these quite carefully before we rush in, because there's the potential for doing more damage. If they don't work well, it can put more people off. And I think that's quite important. It's also worth thinking about, how we go about implementing them in the future, and also what can we do to, not just in the local environment, but can we think about certain interurban journeys where we can have road space reallocation? How can we encourage in the longer term those slightly longer journeys to be carried out by bicycle as well? I was reading another interesting thing earlier in the week about electric bike take up in the UK compared to the rest of Europe. And one of, a bicycle component manufacturer had done a survey across the whole of Europe, and something like 25% of people in mainland Europe either already owned an electric bike or were considering it. Whereas here it's only 7%, dramatic difference. So what can we do to encourage that mode of transport as well, and the associated road space reallocation that goes with it? And also then think about freight as well. So obviously not for long distance freight, but that last mile delivery, what about cargo bikes? What about electric cargo bikes? If we had prioritized lane space for those vehicles, maybe we can deliver some of our goods in different ways as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Skipping around the subjects here, I recognize, so I'm gonna take another direction here. We're going to come zooming off the motorway, and I'm going to come back to Rachel for a minute. So Rachel, you were saying we have the challenge of our lifetimes here. This is a great way to get people engaged and excited about coming into engineering, be that civil engineering, transport planning, vehicle engineering. But what we know about civil engineers is they love a structure, don't they? They love a bridge. I've been to the Institution of Civil Engineers, and it's full of lovely oil paintings of bridges and tunnels and big stuff. So come on, it's all about big stuff, really, isn't it? You guys, you're just looking forward to the Lower Thames crossing.
I think that's grossly unfair, Steve. I think it's fair to say, of course, around the industry, because it is what we have done to some extent over the last however many decades of professional practice. Of course, there are people out there who are keen on the big projects and who are now all over the, whether it's High Speed 2 or Lower Thames Crossing or you name it, of course. And that's, to some extent, that is what I suppose floats some people's boats. I think, though, actually, there are far more people who are genuinely engaged at a more local level. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who work in this industry who don't come near those sorts of big projects and actually get just as much satisfaction out of, I don't know, in a road sense, fixing a roundabout or sorting out a cycleway or putting in a park and ride or whatever it might be. And I think that's also entirely legitimate, if you see what I mean. I think for me, though, that the biggest thing that we could perhaps do differently is to start to change that perception. I mean, why is it people associate engineering with all these things? Well, it's because actually it's what they know, because we've forgotten to tell them about the other bigger things and the wider, you know, sort of transformational things that we actually do at every level, you know, whether you're talking about the most local of the local or the global, you know, transforming the world type stuff that we're all up to all the time. And that to me is a huge missed opportunity that we, I suppose perhaps the carbon element and the literally sort of burning wagon that's rolling by right now is probably the best thing that we can go and leap onto in terms of saying, aha, you know, we are going to be a really key part in fixing this. I totally agree. I can't remember, was it Lynn or Ginny who said that, you know, that is the way to attract people in right now and to change opinions of what we actually do is to relate to the big issues of the world. And right now, actually, in terms of the youngsters trying to figure out what on earth they're going to do with their lives, carbon is a pretty highly featured item. Do you mind if I just very briefly come back to a couple of thoughts on some of the active travel side of things and this thing around rushing schemes in, potentially rushing them out again, that kind of piece? Is that all right? Just very briefly, I promise. One of the things with my WSP hat on for a minute, one of the things we've been doing recently is with the DFT is writing what's called the AMAT guidance, which is the active travel guidance that's been updated in order to be used for both the COVID allocation of funding, both the immediate and the longer run, but also it's sort of the follow on from some of the LC WIP, the local cycling and walking investment side of things. And that same guidance is also now being used into things like the Transforming Cities Fund and so on. The whole point is that, yes, of course, there have been some knee-jerk reactions, and perhaps some of these things have been slightly rushed in, but that was sort of, I suppose, the nature of the beast. But the whole point of the new guidance that is now out and alive is that actually in a reasonably simple way, it's trying to make sure that across the country, we do the right sort of analysis at the local level to actually allow the right strategic questions to be asked about where that money should be spent, both kind of short into medium term, but then also longer run, to actually generate bits of infrastructure that will be genuinely used and, I guess, useful. And I think it's fair to say that while there are some kind of oops moments out there, because I suspect things were rushed in without any real analysis or thought, it was just a case of, right, where can we put stuff? The vast majority of the schemes are getting really positive feedback, and surprisingly positive feedback in some cases. I was involved in an event last week where one of the speakers commented, actually it was one of the ones in one of the local authorities in the southwest, commented that it was one of the first times they'd ever had positive feedback around a cycle scheme going in, because they were the users were delighted and the public were delighted to find there was a new way to get around, which is great. So I guess that there's a very steep learning curve being climbed here, isn't there? Overall, but it does feel like it's a pretty giant step in a direction that I suspect we didn't think we'd otherwise be taking. So again, we maybe need to, in a strange way, thank COVID for making us stop and think about this kind of stuff.
I'm not going to thank COVID, but I'm going to say...
No, I know, I didn't really want to either, but you know what I mean.
never waste a crisis.
Exactly.
I think that's what we're saying. So when Glenn is doing his masterful summing up of this in writing later, never waste a crisis is going to be one of those phrases that he picks up. Now, apologies to people on the online. We're not going to be able to pick up every question you posted, even though we're going to do the full 90 minutes. We've got about just over 10 minutes left. So I'm going to go to Lynn next, as I said, because I want to hear a bit more about this idea of 1,000 flexible workspaces. I'm then going to ask Ginny what she thinks about that as a former leading board member of the Highways Agency and Highways England. Then we're going to do what do people feel about all of those things that go under the banner of road user charging. Lynn said her piece on that, so I'm going to go to Sujith, Natalie, Rachel, in that order. And if Ginny wants to comment on that, then we'll just about have time for a couple of closing words each. And those couple of closing words are going to have to pick up the fact that probably the most famous environmental campaigner in the world at the moment, Greta Thunberg, has said, net zero carbon by 2050, you're not even trying. So how do we feel about that? Lynn, 1,000 flexible workspaces, motorway service areas or what?
So the reason that I think that we need to make Highways England responsible for delivering flexible workspaces is that I think their core objective needs to become to reduce carbon emissions from the strategic road network by about 40 to 50% by 2030. And if the Highways England board were tasked with that objective, I think the things they would turn to pretty quickly are, one, an eco levy on the strategic road network, with arrangements with local authorities through which the SRM passes to make sure that you also had charging on the roads surrounding the strategic road network. Two, much better public transport on that using that network for better public transport. And three, enabling people to connect with each other and to do everything they need to do in their daily lives without even getting onto that network. And part of that is absolutely super fast broadband enabled remote working hubs. Now, I don't actually think that motorway service stations are the best places for those, because on the whole, not that many people live close to motorway service stations. So Highways England might have to get a bit creative, and they might have to start to think about buying up closed banks in town centres and suburban town centres, which could be turned without the need for planning permission into remote working hubs, so that the people who live close to them could just pop in or cycle for 5 minutes to get to them, instead of having to drive on their local road network and the strategic road network to get to their job. And so, although I actually think there might be other people who might start to develop remote working hubs as well, I absolutely think it is something that Highways England, if it was tasked in the right way, should be starting to do, using all of its creativity, all of its fantastic engineering skills, all of its amazing project planning expertise to deal with the problem that we have now, rather than the problem that we thought we had 10 or 20 years ago.
Thank you. And I think, well, Ginny, I mean, you and I know that one of the really big elements of the RIS concept was that Highways England was absolutely told you are allowed to spend money off your own network in order to achieve the right outcomes on that network. I don't think we had quite the full Sloman solution, I'm going to call it, in our minds at the time back in 2015, but maybe we should have that in our minds now.
Well, I agree, actually. It's lovely to be slightly free of not belonging to these organisations anymore, so I can take these suggestions. But I think there'd be organisations like Highways England, welcome the opportunity, if they were given it, I think, to be part of finding these other solutions. Because frankly, any network that is absolutely overrun, it cannot operate properly if it's run. If there's overcapacity to the degree that it is, and I'm sure London Transport would say this as well on the underground. If we were allowed to, as operators, to actually be part of finding what is the solution about making it easier for people to do their daily job, whether it's easier to find a working space. I quite agree. I'm not sure motorway service areas are quite the best places for that. But reality is, we want people to start thinking about life in a different way, don't we? If anything that I've learned from this last 3 months is, what do I value most about spending my time? I quite enjoy doing a bit of work, but actually the opportunity to choose where I do that. And we've shown actually in these last few months, you can do it different ways. So I'm not going to say it's a suggestion that's got a very good solution. And I think whether it's a Highways England, whether it's a local authority transport grouping, whether it's a bus company, if we could think about why we're providing that transport mode, then actually, and be allowed to find some of these solutions and work with the partners who could do it, I think these are part of what we're saying really is the basis for change going forward. It can't be exactly the same as the last 50 years. The next 10 years has to be radically different if we're going to find some solutions. So I welcome ideas like that.
Splendid, Ginny. Okay, but look, I'm looking at the clock. We've got about 7 minutes actually, so not very long to engage with an extremely complicated subject. So can I just say, keep it down to a sort of a sentence or so. Road easy charging. Has its time come? If so, is it a national scheme? Is it a locally promoted set of congestion charges? What's your preference? Sujit first, then Natalie, then Rachel.
Steve, I mean, I think it's inevitable. If we look at what's happening today, we're moving to electric vehicles. Currently, petrol and diesel vehicles, there's that huge tax revenue that comes from fuel tax. That's going to disappear. We can't easily collect that tax revenue from domestic electricity bills. So we're going to have to move to road user charging in one form or another pretty soon. Right now, there's a government consultation on about bringing the date of the of the ban on sales of petrol and diesel vehicles forward from 2040 to either 2035 or 2032. That's pretty soon, right? So we need to be thinking about this very soon. And I honestly, I can't. It's inevitable. I can't see any other options really for maintaining that sort of tax revenue.
Okay, thank you, Sujith. Natalie.
I absolutely agree with Sujith. I think that's exactly what I was going to say. The government's going to be looking at where its tax revenues are going to be coming from in the future. The challenge, of course, is that everybody thinks that everybody else should pay. So kind of how you structure it, when we previously had this kind of national debate, it kind of ended in tears and nothing happened. So we need to have a grown-up discussion about what we want. And we need to be thinking about, you know, the economic value of the journey, the social value of the journey, and all of these things. And of course, we're going to have lots of people, lots of different views about which is more important and what behaviour we should be changing. And one of the other things I just wanted to mention sort of very quickly, which kind of feeds in also to the reallocation of road space thing, and also the issue of should we build more roads. And certainly there are some road schemes, such as the Lower Thames Crossing, actually FTA has been supportive of. But one of the things that we realise, particularly in our towns and cities, we can't build more roads. We have no more space to build more roads. But actually, are we using our roads as efficiently as possible? And I think there's a lot more scope for retiming deliveries. Not everything can be retimed, but where we can and we can do things quietly, let's get as much stuff in quietly overnight. We have too many competing demands in that 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. period. And so we need to be doing much more about enabling different behaviours.
And perhaps pricing could help us do that. I think it's very interesting that the transport data we've seen suggests that it's the morning peak that's not been coming back so much, the afternoon peak perhaps more so. So very briefly, Rachel, I have a faint suspicion you're going to be in favour of some form of road pricing, but prove me wrong.
No, I'm going to join the choir on this one. No, I think I agree. I think it's entirely possible to put together a different set of systems now that would work. I think it probably is inevitable, especially as the electric fleet grows. I'm delighted to be an EV driver at the moment, where I feel I get away significantly more cheaply than I should in terms of my everyday use of the road network at the moment, which I guess it's good for me, but it's obviously not fair for everybody else. And I think actually that would be the key word I'd bring in here. Is I think we have a lot of scope to make the whole thing work in a more fair way. Obviously, everybody who drives pays to some extent now, but we do not have to sort of roll that model forward. There's loads of tunes we can play on it in terms of catering for things like time of day, levels of congestion, essential use, all sorts of things, shared use. If we really wanted to, and I know there are people out there who say it's not possible, actually, if we really wanted to, we absolutely could end up with a system where you could almost choose, the level to which you're willing to pay for whatever trip is, according to how much you need to make it, and how important it is to you, which is the bit which the very blunt instrument right now doesn't really allow us to do. So yeah, I think there's a lot of scope there.
In which case, in the very limited time left, I'm going to pose one last question to the whole panel, and I just want you to, if you agree, put your hand up. So Greta says, just setting a net zero carbon target for 2050 is aiming to fail. Do we need to be more ambitious? Yes or no?
Yes.
I'm putting up my hands for yes, are we?
Yes.
Hands for yes. Okay. Well, there you have it. Everyone watching, the panel thinks we need to be even more ambitious, which means doing even more than we've contemplated, I think, even up to now. We've had some very interesting ideas here. I'm just going to wind up this by saying a big thank you to everyone on the panel, and a big thank you to everyone who's been sending in observations and questions. My apologies to everyone whose question I didn't manage to pick up. I think what I take from this is these words. I think our roads, and I think William Rees Jeffries would agree with this, need to be connected and convivial places. I think that as people professionally involved in planning, managing, and occasionally building our roads, we need to be ambitious, but also optimistic. And I think that, picking up particularly on Rachel's phrase, this is a moment of great challenge and endless opportunity. And the thing about a great challenge and the thing about a crisis is we don't want to waste it. And we need to be more joined up. And that was Ginny's thought, joined up across the professions. That's the thought I want you to take away. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you very much for observing. There'll be more chance for debate as the crisis rolls on, I'm sure. But in the meantime, thank you and goodbye.